I don't have much to say about Kenny that isn't obvious or hasn't already been stated, but I do want to talk about his influence over the show in the context of how the show is produced. As the show progresses, Kenny really starts to own his crew, and even Spenny's crew, and I think even the judges. A really good example of this is Who Do Black Guys Like More? So again, I'm gonna have to spoil this one a little bit, but basically, Kenny dresses as a maid so that Spenny will berate him in a specific way. Kenny then hires a real maid to do all the same things he was doing and shoot that in a very, very specific way, and then they edit these things together to make it look like Spenny is yelling at this maid, and that's used as ammo for Kenny to win this competition. For the episode's ending to work, they have to be filming Spenny in an exploitable way as he's yelling at Kenny, and the same exploitable way when they're filming that maid. This is pretty good clear evidence in this one episode that the crew knows what they're doing and they're in on it. But I think pretty much every episode after the first 10 is a testament to how far the deck is stacked against Spenny by Kenny, the crew, the editing, and so on. Some of the Kenny vs. Spenny crew actually does the commentary for who's the better pro wrestler. They say that everyone knew what was going to happen in the ring at the end of Spenny's match in that episode. That included the crew, but also supposedly impartial parties like Tyson, Celine Dion, the announcer, and so on. Spenny kind of admitted to something similar on the FAQ we were looking at earlier, so this isn't entirely new information. I think that it may have really ramped up after competitions like Who's the More Convincing Woman? In that episode, Kenny's strategy is to try and make Spenny break character, but it doesn't really pay off. Seeing that that strategy failed with those judges, I think Kenny switched gears a little bit. Not by changing his strategy, but just by changing the type of judges. Like in Who's the Best Pro Wrestler or Who Can Imitate the Other Guy Better, you can pretty much guarantee that those judges aren't going to be voting for Spenny on that criteria. As for the editing and filming process itself, I think at some point Kenny realizes that Spenny is watching tapes or the edit of the episode when he shouldn't. There's a live show where Kenny pretty much confirms this.
So I found out that he was going into the edit suites after we shot to find out how I was cheating. Ruins the show, strict contracted rule, he couldn't do it.
That also matches up with Spenny's point on his blog that he made about agreeing to be in the dark for better or for worse. When Spenny broke that rule, Kenny started to screw with Spenny by screwing with the show's presentation itself. Absolutely the most infamous example of this is in Who Can Produce More Semen, where Kenny appears to irradiate Spenny during the episode. We're going to talk more about that later in the series. This kind of deception has a double effect of also deceiving the audience, though. There are actually a ton of episodes where Kenny doesn't let us, the audience, in on the joke, and we end up getting deceived for not as long as Spenny, but for a time. It's kind of hard to list all of these off without spoiling the episodes, but here's just a handful. Who can stay naked the longest? Who's the better figure skater? Who's cooler? Who can stay tied to a goat the longest? Who can produce more semen? Who can keep their head in a chicken coop the longest? And who can bone more women? It definitely makes the show less real when Kenny isn't leveling with the audience on this stuff. There's even an interview in VYVCH from 2007 where Kenny says he likes deceiving the audience. So whatever trouble that all of that has caused Kenny, it's kind of his own fault. Sometimes Kenny's just doing little things to freak out Spenny. The lie detector in Boner is one example, obviously the radiation machine. In the Who Can Smoke More Weed commentary, Kenny mentions having bags of fake weed, maybe to psych out Spenny to think he had more or less than he did. I talked earlier about the payoff in Who Do Black People Like More, and I think that that's actually a really good episode for explaining how the show works in general. First, Kenny provokes the worst out of Spenny in one context, and then Kenny drives the editing to make Spenny look even worse within another context. And then Kenny shows the judges, who in this case is us, the end result, and we're horrified. This is just an unrelated point, but one thing that I try to think about when watching an episode is, what if all of this didn't work out? In other words, what if Spenny didn't fall for it? So we can see this in Who's the Better Rapper. We see kind of the opposite in Who Can Kiss More Women, where Spenny doesn't fall for something that doesn't actually appear to be a ruse. And in First One to Touch the Ground loses. I can't tell if Kenny's Bond villain character is a sincere attempt at getting Spenny to touch the ground, but in any case it failed. Another way things might not work out if the judges don't really go for Kenny in the end. I already kind of talked about this, but especially in early shows like Who is Sanest, Who's the More Convincing Woman, Who's a Better Stripper, the judges really do appreciate Spenny's authenticity, and so it doesn't really go Kenny's way. The bigger question here is, what if the major narrative of an episode didn't work out? For example, in Who Can Stay on an Island the Longest, Kenny pitches to Spenny that they just enjoy their time in this island resort and then do a double humiliation, because nobody really won or lost.
I need someone to tell me what's going on right now.
Okay.
You're gonna tell me? No!
I can only guess how planned it really was, but by the end, Kenny actually manages to trick Spenny into leaving the island. I can't know if that was planned from the start or if Kenny thought about it on the fly. I also don't know if it would have worked out or not, but regardless, if it didn't work out in whatever way, Kenny maybe just wouldn't have included it in the show. There are also a few other cases of Kenny trying and failing, but usually on a smaller scale. Another good example is First One to Laugh Loses, where Kenny just really can't make Spenny laugh at all. What I notice is that some episodes are really insulated against failure. And so when you think that that episode is really so perfect, you realize that it couldn't have gone any other way. The best example of this is the arm wrestling competition. I'm going to get kind of abstract here without straying into 4D chess territory, so bear with me. In the arm wrestling competition, Kenny seeks out a different person named Spencer Rice, a kid, and then arm wrestles him and wins. Kenny then makes that other Spencer Rice do a humiliation, and then he flies home from Sault Ste. Marie and reveals this to Spenny. Spenny's outraged. He calls Kenny a coward, challenges him in that moment to arm wrestle him. Kenny does, and Kenny wins. And then the real Spenny, our Spenny, has to do a real humiliation. So consider this. When Kenny gets home from Sault Ste. Marie, he already has a full episode's worth of footage. So there are a few ways for the episode to actually end, depending on whether Spenny agrees that this translates into a loss, agrees to do a humiliation, agrees to arm wrestle him again, or actually wins it. In option A, Kenny would explain what he did in Sault Ste. Marie to Spenny. Spenny would agree that this translates to his own defeat, and then Spenny would do a humiliation. Of course, Kenny would keep that into the episode. In option B, it would be the same as before, except Spenny would refuse to acknowledge that as his own defeat and refuse to do a humiliation. Option C is the thing that actually happens in the episode. Kenny explains the scam to Spenny. Spenny rejects that that's actually his own loss, challenges Kenny to an arm wrestling competition right then and there, and then the real Spenny loses. Option D would be that same thing as option C, except Spenny wins the arm wrestling competition that they do in the kitchen. Regardless of which of those options actually happen, Kenny can control the edit and choose his own adventure. If option A happens, and Spenny concedes, and Spenny does a humiliation, obviously he would show that. If option B were to happen, Spenny doesn't want to do a humiliation, he doesn't want to arm wrestle Kenny, then Kenny just wouldn't show that segment, and the episode would end after he came back from Sault Ste. Marie. We see option C happen, obviously Kenny keeps it in the episode. If option D were to happen, and Spenny would have won the arm wrestling competition in the kitchen, then Kenny could just not put that in the episode. He could again just end it after he gets back from Sault Ste. Marie, and even if he did a humiliation, he wouldn't have to show it. But it's up to him. And remember what I said before, if Spenny were to spend this whole episode training and then win the competition at the end, that's not really a subversion, is it? Now, how do we explain Spenny? I think this is the key to understanding the truth within Kenny vs. Spenny, and I'd summarize it as this. The truth can be so much weirder than a lie ever could. First of all, who could write this guy? What I mean by this is, you simply can't presume that the show is strictly scripted. Nobody would be able to come up with the stuff he says, and even if they did, he couldn't pull it off. The things Spenny says are so odd. He writes a letter to children written by Uncle Erogenous? I would go as far as to say that Spenny can't even be fed lines in any instance where he would need to say something to make the narrative work.
When I don't know the line, just sort of feed it to me, like, and then say a question in the form of a question.
Okay, so I can say, yeah.
Okay.
What is it, Louis?
It is... What is what?
Come on, you gotta know that.
No, I'm blanking out. I'm fucking blanking out. It's just bad.
Just scratch, the show has a script off your list. It's a frequently cited point, but Spenny can't act. At least not naturally. His monologue in Who's the Better Actor is actually pretty good, I think. A bit of really great evidence is this PSA clip. So it's a Canadian public service announcement by Spenny. He's reliving some moments of the show as a caricature of himself. And the message is, I'm stupid, but I'm not stupid enough to drink and drive. This is confirmation of a few things to me. 1, Spenny is aware of being the butt of the joke. 2, Spenny is aware that he has behaved naively in the past. And 3, Spenny is being explicitly asked to act like himself as he has in the past, and he cannot. It's very awkward. Can you imagine scripting a classic Spenny moment and telling him to act this way on cue? I really don't think he could. Also, single white Spenny is bad, and he doesn't do a good job in it, but it's not that bad. But still, it's at least different. There's definitely a dynamic that he and Kenny play into, and they're both dialed up. This is a pretty conventional wisdom among fans, and I'm not saying anything new. I think Spenny acts haughty and pretentious because it's his show too, and when he's not being yelled over, he's finally capable of taking his time to say exactly what's on his mind about a topic or competition. That means that sometimes when Spenny finally has his stage, what comes out of his mouth seems really pent up and insane. I think all the time that Kenny takes to entertain us, Spenny likes to take to educate us, and he definitely turns into a caricature of himself by the end of the show. You can really see this in Who Can Smoke More Weed. It's kind of hard to catch, but hopefully you'll understand what I mean. Spenny is really, really high, and he comes downstairs to give some light trash talk to Kenny about, I'm gonna beat you, I'm gonna win, I'm doing this for a cause.
Please, all you have to do is say you give up. I will continue to smoke, because you know why? Because I'm smoking for a cause.
Are you smoking for the cause?
Not the cause.
Oh my God, that's unbelievable. We all love you, cause, and we know you haven't been doing well lately, but we just
He's doing very well.
It comes across as really disingenuous and awkward because he's just way too high. The moralizing and the trash talk that we've seen in other episodes is there, but it's just coming out wrong. Like, he knows he's got to do it, but he doesn't remember how. I'm not going to talk about Pandemic really in this series, but you see it there too, where Spenny really jumps into that subroutine of complaining and moralizing and stuff. It's hard to tell whether he's doing it because he knows it's funny or if that's really him. I think it's a chicken and egg thing where I think it's really hard to tell where it started, and the show enabled this positive feedback loop of eggs making chickens, making eggs, making chickens, and now it's just out of control. Spenny clearly has a sense of humor and likes comedy. There's definitely a subconscious part of him that knows he needs to feed the insanity because he knows that that's funny and that the show becomes good when he does it. I don't think he has good control over it, and I don't really think he knows why it's funny at the time either.
Okay, 1 second. I want to get this straight. Are you doing that stuff to, like, intentionally be funny, or are you serious about it? Because I can't tell anymore.
I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about?
What we just showed.
Another note on Spenny having a sense of humor is that he actually finds Kenny funny sometimes. He gives him credit where credit's due. Spenny's fast to appreciate Kenny, and there are even moments in the show where he's smiling through all the horror. It's also true that Spenny's definitely aware of the issues he has, whereas Kenny's less introspective. Spenny clearly knows that the show is funny, it's gonna be funny, people will love it, people might even love him, and that he'll live to fight another day. There are a few times in the show where Spenny asserts that he's the king of endurance competitions, and I think that's interesting.
And let me tell you, shut up!
Yeah.
And let me tell you something. This is an endurance competition. I'll say it once and I'll say it again. I am the king of endurance between the two of us. It's me, not you. Bring these birds out here. Let's go. I'm ready to go right now.
I mentioned earlier how you can think of Kenny versus Spenny as who can make a better show, whereas I think Spenny treats it as an endurance competition. How much humiliation can he, his spirit, his soul, his credibility endure? If you frame it like this, you can kind of see why he doesn't give up so quickly, even though sometimes he does. Another big question around Spenny is, why does he keep doing it? I think Spenny has such an obsession with the big picture that he's motivated by the idea that somewhere down the line, on some theoretical judgment day, people are going to recognize that he did compete, he did try, and that he will prevail, someday. I think his righteousness and his virtuosity also explains why he'd do such bizarre, self-sacrificing, and embarrassing things. The virtue really gives him confidence to do anything, given that he believes that what he's doing is for the right reasons. I'm not sure I agree with it, but you may have heard the claim that good people will do good things, bad people will do bad things, but to make good people do bad things, you need religion, or you need some kind of ideology. I think in that same way, this weird quasi-religious idolatry that Spenny obeys makes him act bizarre and self-destructive. Kenny's maybe a bit similar, except his religion is what's funny. He'll do what it takes, including destroying his friend. If you think that this is an abstract take on why Spenny does it, you should also know that Spenny was divorced with 2 kids by the time the show ended. He really needed the money. On that note, I think Spenny's mental state raises a greater point about the ethics of the show that I think about sometimes. Spenny is clearly severely mentally ill, and he admits to abusing drugs during the show. If you've been to their live show or watched recordings of it, he appears to be belligerently drunk, and I've seen stories of him beating up and pushing around audience members. He even mentions during one that he was taking a lot of prescription medications during the filming of Kenny vs. Spenny. Anyway, I am deeply, deeply unqualified to talk about any of this, but all you need to imagine for Kenny vs. Spenny to be real is that Spenny is truly that troubled, and Kenny is truly that opportunistic that he's willing to take advantage of it. You could probably take the raw footage they have of Kenny vs. Spenny and put together a really, really real documentary about Spenny's mental collapse throughout the 6 seasons of the show. I mean, Kenny says it in the Christmas episode and in some of the live shows.
I broke his brain.
Kenny destroyed his friend for our amusement. If all of this sounds pretty pretentious, it's kind of because it is. The first thing you'll notice about the show is that it has a lot of crude, caveman, pee-pee poo-poo humor. That comes through pretty clearly on its own, so I'm not saying much about it here. Anyway, in summary, I pretty much accept at face value what Spenny has written on his site. What you see is real, with some emphasis either coming naturally from a stream of consciousness or the pressure of making a TV show. I think in some cases he's acting strange due to some antidepressant, anxiety, or some other kind of medication or problem. In other cases, he's been put into a frenzy by Kenny's constant goading. Nothing is a better example than the suitcase rant. If you watch that, I don't think that outtake can exist to the extent that it does without there being real, sincere frustration coming out of Spenny. In some episodes, Spenny gets goaded by the crew or gives up his moralism in general and tries to go toe-to-toe with Kenny. That happens in Who Can or Who's the Bigger Idiot. I think that's an evolution of Spenny's character where he's able to give up his resistance and try to beat Kenny at his own game. Of course, it pretty much doesn't work. There is one thing that still puzzles me about Spenny. He's able to go from bizarrely angry, sadistically violent, or creepily childish, to being oddly educated, lucid, and at very least a different kind of weirdo. He clearly reads to some extent. He's aware of comedy and music. If you compare that to some of his failed endeavors and enterprises, he seems oddly naive. Like Hubert the Hoppopotamus, Spozo's Funtime Pizza, his rapping, his horrible play. I think this quote from Spenny says a lot about his outlook and himself.